Hello and welcome to another episode of Mind My Age, the podcast where we explore the journeys and wisdom behind healthier, more fulfilling aging. I'm your host, Neelam Brar, and today we're diving into the topic that's close to many of our hearts, how to capture all the amazing experiences that we've accumulated throughout our lives and share them as a captivating story for future generations. Whether you're thinking of writing a memoir or simply wanting to pass on your wisdom, today's guest here to guide us throughout that process. Please welcome Kate Brenton, a published author, a podcaster, and educator who specializes in helping people bring their brilliance and wisdom into the world through storytelling. Listeners, if you have been thinking about writing a memoir or keeping a keepsake for future generations, then this is the one for you to listen to. Kate, thank you for joining us.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So to start, let me ask you a question we ask all of our guests. How old do you feel from a physical health standpoint? And what's your secret to staying so vibrant and inspired?
Sure. I think physically, I feel like I'm in my 30s. I stay very active. I have stayed pretty active. I have a pretty clean diet just because I like to do things. Like that was my motivating force. I want to be able to do as many things as possible. And now in my 40s, I have a 6-year-old son. And so I have even more motivation to I want to be the parent that can go hiking or go to the baseball games. And so I've just learned to stay active and keep staying active, basically. Yoga, walking, hiking, eating healthy.
Amazing. And having like a nice combination of health, diet, motion, and balance is extremely important. It sounds like you found that.
I found that early on. Someone explained to me Ayurveda really early on, and I'm not an Ayurvedic practitioner, but it was an aperture for me to understand that this is why different people have to eat differently, and I just have to figure out what works for me and stick to it. It helped. It made it very common sense for me.
Kate, you're known for helping people ignite their intentions and bring their stories to life. For our listeners who have lived rich, full lives, but might feel unsure about how to start capturing those experiences in, a memoir or otherwise, what's the first step?
The first step is deciding that your story is worth telling. A lot of times when people start writing, they feel like they'll compare outside of themselves or think it's not really that big of a deal. But if you understand why you're writing, then that's a value enough. So if you're writing it for yourself, journal. Some people start to journal or write letters to their children so that they can open them later. It's a brilliant way to pass your wisdom on, kind of like a keepsake for them to open. If you're wondering about a memoir, I tell people, like in the book that I wrote, I asked people about like a fulcrum moment and what they learned, and then build the story from there. And a lot of times those moments, like your brightest moments right before them, are the ones that you had the most doubt. And traversing the doubt and sharing what you've earned as wisdom is the natural arc of every story. It's the natural arc of all the major movies: being confused or lost, finding a moment of courage, and then creating resolution. And so if you just remember that your story is as epic as what people go to the movie theaters to see, because it's a human story, then that's really the place to start.
I love that. I recently was reading a quote about, you can't celebrate or even appreciate the highs without experiencing the lows. And so they go together hand in hand. And if you can pull that into a story, it's so valuable.
Totally.
So many of our listeners might be thinking, well, who wants to read my life? How can they overcome that self-doubt and see the value in their own story?
Well, it goes back to the first thing. The first thing you have to do is decide your story is worth reading. Because if you don't think it's worth reading, then you're going to choose language and your hesitancy is going to come across in your voice. And so a lot of times when we start, our mind will jump to the finished product. That is the second thing. Don't jump to the finished product. There's writing to capture the idea. That's one style of writing. That's where you start. And then there's refinement. So if your mind starts to say, well, how's that going to fit into a book? Or am I writing enough? Just tell yourself that's for the refinement phase. That's not the phase I'm in right now. Right now, I'm just going to make my cup of coffee or my tea or sit down in the afternoon in my favorite spot. One quick tip is that we acclimate quickly to an environment. So if you decide to write something, create a space in your home. And if you're in a smaller living space now, then bring fresh flowers to your kitchen table and set your kitchen table out. And this is my writing space. If you honor it with a candle or a little bit of flowers, you're telling your inner muse, I'm ready and I'm going to share my story. And it's not finding value that somebody else has, which is very common today, but it's mining within and bringing that out to the world.
So I'm 45 and I feel like I have a gazillion stories that I could start putting down on paper, but I really wouldn't know where to start. And I like what you're saying, which is just start. But like for those of us that need a little bit more guidance, like what's an approach to starting? Like where do I start in my life? Like do I start when I was 10? Like where do I start?
Your inspiration is that you want to write. That's your inspiration. Your inspiration is like going to a food court. There's like 20 choices and not one choice is not better than the other, but you can't eat 20 things at one time. So inspiration is like, I might have 20 epic moments in my life. You have to pick one. You have to pick one. And when you're like, well, I don't know which one to start with. Well, when you think about what's your intention for writing, is it for you? Is it for your children? Is it a wisdom piece? Is it a business piece? Decide what genre of piece it is and then start writing. And if you write your intention out, this is what, when I work with people, I tell them, write your intention out, what you want to achieve. And then when it gets to the refinement, otherwise known as the editorial phase, you'll be able to say like, oh, that's a great story, but it actually doesn't fit with my intention to tell people that aging is graceful. Like this business story actually belongs in a wisdom piece. So if you have an intention and you also set up writing time, two things this always happens. Whenever you start writing, the stories that you don't think are worth it are gonna come flooding in. They're gonna come flooding in because you've created space for them. So you can stick to your intention and keep writing that one arc, or you can grab the additional stories that are coming out because you're listening and you just write them on a Post-it note. Just write them on a Post-it note and say, I'll get to you later, Post-it note. I'm not saying you're not good enough. I'm just going to hold on to you for later. And if you can decide, so first step would be decide that your story's worth it. Second step is to write your intention down. And then your third step would be to commit to following that intention through, because between deciding on your intention and writing is when doubt comes in. And if you know to expect it, you just write right through it.
I love that. And for those of us that are listening that think mom and dad, it'd be great for mom and dad to write their stories because they just have so many. And you know, as we get into our busy lives, we're not good at extracting them from them or asking them the right questions. What do you think is a great way to approach the idea of writing a memoir with mom and dad?
I think recording them talking and getting them into a space of ease would be the best way for the questions to come out. If you give them presence, what a story wants is presence, right? A book can't be read if you don't open it. Movies make a lot of money from the emotional journey that the audience goes on. So if you want them to open up, you're going to have to decide to make the time to be with them. So make a moment to be with them, because they'll drop a story and something in you is going to light up and lean in, and they're going to go, oh no, that story? And you're going to go, yeah, I want to hear about that story. And don't be afraid to ask them specific questions. I actually did this with my own grandparents, and I would ask them, well, what were you eating? Where did you go to lunch? What were you wearing? And they'd be like, Katie, because they would call me Katie. Why are you asking these questions? But I learned, I did it on intuition, if I'm completely honest. But what I learned from following those questions is if you ask them detailed sense questions, eating, dancing, place, it activates a part of their memory and the stories start to flow.
And it's so interesting because I've been more intentional about having these conversations with dad more than mom lately, but like the emotional side of his stories, like you can just see his eyes well up sometimes when he's telling them to me, and they just create such a firm imprint on my soul when he tells them to me that I've been thinking more and more about how do I get more out of him and record them this time so that other generations can see these too.
I would just take my grandmother to lunch and I would ask her all kinds of questions. I would even ask her questions about my grandfather passing. And because I've always asked questions, I just started, the consistency of the asking. Once a repertoire was set up, what you're gifting them is that their stories are worth it. So when you're listening and you're giving them intention and they know that you're so busy, you have so many other things to do, soul to soul, I'm so glad you used that word, soul to soul recognizes that. And there's wisdom embedded in them that's waiting. Like our journey turns, right? When we're born, everyone's about us. And I mean that lovingly. Then we kind of rise up and we're learning and we're doing. And then all of a sudden something shifts and you shift to giving back to the world. And some parents might feel like, well, I provided and I just did the best I can. But right below that statement is, I guarantee you, are at least 3 amazing stories that would blow your mind at what your parent or an elder you're inspired by is waiting to gift to someone, because they might not even consciously know, but they're waiting.
And you say something so interesting with the statement of they might not consciously know, because there's so much that's passed along generation to generation unconsciously that we're not even aware of until we kind of connect the dots and we're like, oh, that's why I behave a certain way. It's because, like of the trauma or the experience that mom and dad faced, they passed that along to me. And I think through storytelling, we can raise that stuff to the surface sometimes. An example I recently been sitting with is like, my dad told me a story that, when he first came to Canada, he was trying to find a way to make ends meet and provide for the family, etc. So he got a real estate license, agent license. My dad's not a salesman. And he had this agent license, and he would sit at the office, trying to find a house to sell. And the office had like a nearby deli that he would go for lunch. And whenever he'd go, he'd always buy the Danish or that was a day old because it was half off, because he wanted to save the money for his family. And it just, like, even talking about that makes me so sad to think like that's how much they sacrificed.
He cared, yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so now when I look at things half off, it's like I should buy one too. But I love a good deal, and I'm like,
I love that.
Right? It probably comes from, just that unspoken resilience and tenacity and loyalty towards making ends meet.
I have had experiences where stories that come out, like, because we do inherit trauma, there's stories, but they're also the nature of the universe. There's the opposite. And sometimes as a child, you might feel like you know the whole story, but then when you start to hear like something like the half Danish, you realize, okay, maybe in my teenage years, I thought my parents didn't spend enough money on XYZ. But then you realize that 10 years before that, they were doing all of that to bring you to the moment. And it doesn't have to be one supplanting the other, but the stories bring us back to wholeness. They bring us back to like, this is a person, because for so long, a lot of our ancestors or our relatives, we don't see them as people. It's easier to see those archetypes outside. So I really think it's a lost art of storytelling. And I know that some elders I've spoken with, they say, well, I don't have any children, so there's no one. I say, oh, then you have even more stories, because you've been waiting to gift them somewhere. So it can be very cathartic for people to understand that the miniature choices that they've made are of value enough. And when you are receiving that from another living being, you get a gift that can't really be quantified. And if you ask for help, the story will reveal itself. I'm also a big believer in that. If you just listen and ask the right questions, the story will lead itself.
That's so beautiful. And so when somebody is ready to start writing those stories down, what do you think is the best way to organize all of those memories into a cohesive narrative? You'd said start with intention. What next?
It's a great question. So now we're switching into refining, where my answers might seem in opposition to what I said before. So once you decide and you have, say you thought this was going to be hard, and then you made a goal of getting like three to 5 stories, and you look at them, you might love all of them, but they won't all work probably in an arc unless you've been really organized. Say you just went and you just let it go. Pick one that works for you, or an idea, and then I find the easiest way, if this is something that's really new to you, write a bullet point of each of them on a Post-it note and organize them. And it's going to be hard to do if this is very emotional for you. So sometimes you just need a friend it doesn't have to be an editor, just someone like you just ask them what would they want to know next? Like start to reiterate the stories you've had. You can ask people a couple questions. You can ask, what would you like to know next? What doesn't seem to fit? What is the most confusing? And when you start to ask the opposite questions like that, you can pull out Post-it notes that don't work. Because this is a quote from Cheryl Strait. I was in a workshop with her at one point in time. It was a really small one. And the best advice she gave was, you can't write on the steam of what happened. You just can't write, this is next. If you're just collecting stories for your family ancestry, then be glad that you've captured them. If you're trying to take that family ancestry and make it more cohesive, and you think, I want to have an editorial arc, you will have to solidify your intention into, what are the 2 essential questions or feelings that I want my reader to have? And then every story that you collect needs to promote that idea. So if you're saying, I want to show how, just since you gave me the Danish one, and I don't know anything about your father, just saying, I want to know how self-sacrifice leads to family triumph. Right?
I love that.
Yeah. And then it becomes something that grows, and it's a wisdom piece. And then that's something that like you could hand off to a grandchild, and they could be like, oh, I don't need to be told instant gratification won't get me there. I can be in awe of how self-sacrifice grows the family legacy. Is that helpful? Is that clear enough?
Wow, like you nailed it. I'm going to take that home to my dad. And I mean, even from that perspective, if we continue on that example, he can use storytelling to grow personally, feel more purpose in his achievements, and really solidify his emotional well-being too, because it allows somebody to feel proud.
Yes. Because a lot of times, especially if we're in a role of parent, we're doing. There's not, you can say there's time for reflection, but there might not have been. And in retelling the story, an alchemy is created, and your vision is further along in the story. So you understand how the universal thread worked out for you, or didn't work out for you, or in the fact that it didn't work out for you, something better came along. And if I may, if someone's listening and they're thinking of their own memoir and they're stuck on a story that they keep telling in a way that's not empowering, a really simple exercise is to think of an important conversation in your life and write the dialogue out. Don't worry about it being perfect, just staccato, which means this, that, the next person, and then turn the page and you write it from the opposite person's perspective. So you have a story about someone and they did you wrong, and first time you write it, you write it out about, how right you are, and then you turn the page and you write it from the other person's perspective. And sometimes you can just feel your brain be like, no, wait, you start to see that some of the stories that you hold, you're only holding them in one side, and there's another person's side to it. And storytelling is about shifting perspective. And if you're someone that takes this and starts to run with it, you'll start to understand that the perspective of which you tell the story is as much a part of the tool.
I love that. I think we could use that exercise for any argument we get into with anybody, like a friend, a husband, a boyfriend, like it's just so important to take a moment to just fully understand the other person's side. Many people struggle with the fear of being judged or misunderstood when they share their personal stories. I can personally reflect and say, like, when I thought about even starting this podcast, putting my name out there, I was really apprehensive because I was worried about saying the wrong thing or being judged. And ultimately, I'm enjoying this more than I've enjoyed anything I've done. And so, like, what are your advice or tips for people to move past that fear and bring their authentic self to the writing?
Well, I think you've already shine the light on the key. The judgment is the indicator of what's on the other side. So the bigger the fear of judgment, probably the closer you are to engaging in something that will bring you great joy, because you're afraid of doing it wrong, or you're afraid of hurting somebody, or you're afraid of failure, which we all are. I mean, all those things are basic human fears. So I would love to tell you that judgment won't happen, but we all know it will, because it will. And so you toughen up your skin a little bit, and you do not let judgment be an indicator of the rightness of what you're doing. You let that feeling inside of either, a lot of times I'll have clients and they'll be like, I don't really know why I'm doing this. I'm like, that's the perfect reason, because that means something inside of you is moving you forward and it's not your logical brain. And here we go, because you're trusting a non-logical, non-quantifiable reason to start a project. And that means something really beautiful is coming for you.
That's so amazing. You have this program called Sit and Write that helps people move from that inspiration to action, sometimes reluctantly. For someone who's always wanted to write about their life or even tell a few short stories, but feels overwhelmed by the process, where do you have them begin? Is it to come to a Sit and Write program?
Well, what I actually do is anyone who's interested in Sit and Write, I meet with them first, just a 15-minute, because I tell people your stories are sacred and you should have alchemy with the person, and I might not be the person. That throws people off. It's not a shtick, though. You should take your stories very seriously and make sure there's boundaries for them. It also empowers you to know that you're the gatekeeper of your story, because then you're going to go on a journey. And the journey is going to be that you're really clear. You're either going to start in one of two places. You're really clear, and then you're going to go through massive doubt and come back to your clarity. Or you're not clear and you're going to stick with it and you're going to skyrocket into a solution. That's the two gateways people walk through to work with me. Doubt's inherent in one of them, in both of them. They'll just manifest in different ways. And the way Sit and Write is structured is that it is, you work personally with me to go from inspiration to intention. Because if you stay in inspiration, nothing comes into form, because it's always someday, or this idea is better than that one, and the pitch of the voice stays really high. Intention is, this is the one story I'm going to write. I can hear 10 others, just like you might have 10 other plants in your garden, but you can only weed one garden at a time, or whatever your metaphor is. You make a commitment to the one. And then we go on the path of work. I don't ghostwrite. It's almost like I keep people, I have a background in writing and all of that, but I keep people going and turn their story over to them. And then we have a community space where people start to realize that doubting their voice, it's not some people are a little like, I don't want to share my writing. I'm like, no, I understand. A lot of times people put their shoulders up because they're not ready in the beginning. And I think that's a good boundary. But when you are in a community space, you start to realize that the doubts that you have, that you are convinced you're the only one that you have, is actually an expected part of your journey. And then somewhere in the middle of the 4-month container, we start sharing our work, because we realize we're all on the same goal of finishing our own stories, and there's no competition, there's collaboration. And most people finish with, I would say, like 50 to 60% of a first draft finished, depending on where they are, which is enough of the bones to go advocate. And they also learn a little bit about how to bring that out into the world if that's what they decide to do.
That's so beautiful. For those who feel like they've lost touch with their creativity, are there certain exercises they can be doing to reconnect and start expressing themselves again? Like, I know even with myself, if I look at my dad, he's become so quiet and so reflective, and it takes him a lot to share his feelings and thoughts. How do we get people talking again?
My first response is, especially with the elderly, is I would, and I'm saying elderly not of mind, but just of phase, is music. Like, you want the brain to tell you the stories, but I've watched where get them eating. One of the tricks with my grandfather is I'd always bring him apricots, or I would bring him his favorite cinnamon roll, because the taste brings them back to a time, and then they're not in what isn't happening. They're in the part of themselves that remembers that creativity and is proud. And and you'll be amazed at what starts to happen. You can see, it's in the shortcut is the body. You want the stories of the mind, but what you want to engage is the body. So that the easiest way to do that is music or food, to remind them that they're worthy, because you in front of the elder is excited, but they're bombarded every day about what they no longer are in our current culture. And so creating a space. If it's not an elder and you want creativity, it's again the body. Like get up in the morning. Like if you have a very busy life, 10 minutes of journaling in the morning and getting that creativity going, or moving your body, because the bodies live in the stories live in the body. I work with people and it'll show up in different places. So if you move the body, you also call that memory forward. And you don't have to get fancy. You can walk for 10 minutes. You could do 10 minutes of yoga stretching, and I would start small. Instead of trying to do something really big and then not doing it on day 2, I would start really small and choose to do it 3 days a week and start to retrain yourself to be creative again.
Oh, it's so amazing. And like the fact that you can use your senses to spark your creativity and your mood towards feeling like you have something to write is such an interesting hack. So reflection and writing can be overwhelming, especially when you delve into those personal experiences. And I think that's what stops a lot of people because, like you said, there's a lot of negative self-talk. And that is usually louder than the positive experiences. And that's unfortunate, but our minds work that way, and we need to train them to not do that. Um, how do you think therapy can help unlock these stories and make the process more manageable?
I feel like therapy helps orient your perspective. So you have a one-sided story of what you did that was wrong. We'll just use that as an easy way. And therapy might say, well, did you realize that you did the best that, like, it opens the aperture of context. And so then you start to realize, well, is it possible that I actually did the best that was available to me? Is it possible that my mind is remembering the 2 things I didn't do? But the reality when I tell the story out loud, or I'm asked questions in a safe container, is there's like 7 things I did really well, but I'm only focused on what was wrong. I think therapy, especially if it includes the body in some way, or the holistic approach of the person, brings, I'll say, parts of you to the table that might have left. Sometimes when really big things happen, part of us just shuts down. And until we feel safe, it doesn't come back to share its perspective. And that's a felt experience. It can come out in a story, but those pieces are a felt experience.
If we shift over now to living with purpose and embracing change, your book, Rebirth, real life stories about what happens when you let go and let life lead, and your podcast, Rebirth, have touched many lives. What inspired you to create these, and how do they tie into your overall mission?
I know you're gonna love this answer, actually. So I do holistic healing work as well. And when I had my son at 41, I had an unplanned emergency C-section. And so my life pivoted, and I've always been really good at helping people put stories together, whether it's in healing or in the actual written word. And so I was kind of told that I'd have to stop a lot of things, and that didn't make sense to me. So a friend said, you should start a podcast. And I was like, I don't have a lot of time. I have a newborn. Fast forward, the podcast does really well. And a friend that is starting an all women's publishing company says, you should write a book. And I'm like, well, that's on my list. But right now I have a 2.5-year-old, and 2.5 and writing a book are just, with the resources that I had, really were divergent. And then we had this moment where she said, you should compile the stories of the podcast. And I thought, that's a great idea, because these are all people that I know or I've come in touch with. And all of them, the whole idea of Rebirth was, even though I thought I understood holistic living, it wasn't until I became a mother, which is not the only pathway. It was just my pathway of learning that I couldn't control everything, that effort wasn't going to be the only resulting force. I had to surrender and kind of harness other energies. So the reason, this is the part I think you might enjoy, is that I wrote the first draft of the book, and it had all of these amazing stories of all these amazing people. And my publisher said, but you're not in it. And I said, well, no. These are all the stories that you wanted of other people. She said, well, but no one's going to pick up the book if you're not in it, because it's your book. And I thought, isn't the mind an interesting thing, that you can say that you're fully aware of what you're doing and you write this book for all the other people, but you still don't, even with a paid publishing contract, you don't think your own story was worth it. And I had to rewrite, and it was a big catalyst moment for me of understanding how even when we're in the profession of helping others, we'll hit a wall until we include ourselves. And so then the aperture of the book changed, and I started to insert parts of myself, and it helped create some cohesion. But I laugh now when I meet women that are really gung-ho and type A, and are still hiding themselves. And it's easier to see because I did it. I did it even at a point in my life where I didn't know that hiding was still so active.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It really took me 45 years to realize that I have something to offer. I had friends 15 years ago saying to me things like, "Man, you're so good at finance." I was in banking, investment banking, actually, like so top of the career. And I didn't think I had anything to offer on finance and anything. And today you look at influencers that are like having Instagram pages where they just teach you how to use Excel or they teach you personal finance. And it's interesting because of course I knew all of that, but I didn't think it was enough. And that's a mental block. That's like a self-belief block. And it only recently hit me that I need to shift how I think about myself.
And life will give you those, you can see those circumstances as impediments or you can see them as opportunities, right? That you can include yourself.
Well, and also you said something really interesting around purpose, right? Like, I don't think it was my purpose to talk about finance. I wasn't passionate about it. I am so much more passionate about health and well-being. And so this company I've launched 3 years ago has brought a lot of fulfillment because we help thousands of seniors every day feel better through therapy. And this podcast allows me to meet amazing people like you that can help our older adults and help ourselves, improve our outlook and well-being as we age, which is so important.
For those that are listening that assume that they're the one that we're not talking to and say the world is changing so fast, what could I have to share? That's exactly why we need those stories more. I'm not being flippant. I put my son in places where there's intergenerational people because I think that the key to what the change that we need right now is that marriage of those that are coming in and those that have led a life and are sitting with wisdom to share. And it will only take a few sparks for humanity to remember that that's how we work. I mean, that's how we grow. So I really do hope that this encourages someone who was convinced that they weren't, their story wasn't necessary, that it is, simply because it was lived.
Absolutely. And research shows that aligning with one's purpose significantly impacts mental well-being, particularly as we age. So, in your opinion, how can listeners find and align with their core value to live a fulfilled life and cultivate these qualities in the writing and of course, in their lives?
It goes back to choosing to believe in your worth. Purpose. I love that you made the differentiation between passion and purpose because I think there's different phases. Sometimes we do different work in different phases or seasons of our life, and wishing that we are in a different season is not going to be incredibly helpful, but embracing the season that we're in. And I often find that purpose is the quietest voice, but it creates the most levity in the body. It's like, why would I do that? But I just love doing it. That when you're like, I don't know, I just love doing it. Your face just lights up. And once you start to decide that levity or that smile, as trite as it sounds, is enough, then the boulders start to get bigger. They happen in the smallest little pebbles. But then when you entrain that that's the frequency that you want to be feeling and you will decide that that's true, it'll increase.
Kate, can you share some empowering stories from the work you've done where individuals found growth through change? These examples could be really inspiring for our listeners.
Sure. Growth through change. I knew someone that retired from a very prestigious position and chose their retirement at a time that they were still at the apex. It was obviously going to happen between 2 and 3 years, and they waited and waited, and they were like, "I'm at the apex, and I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna retire." And so the first 2 months that they retired, they were acclimating to the retiring, and then they booked a trip to Spain, and they went solo to Spain. And when they came back, their retirement was completely integrated in a new way. And what I learned from this person was that he said I had a choice. In those 2 months, I gave myself 2 months to grieve what I no longer was. And then I understood that if I didn't go someplace different to celebrate what I had done, I would stay in the grief of what I no longer was. And I watched that person come back from the trip from Spain and take on two different hobbies, embrace grandfathering in a whole different way. And I'm going to get emotional. And his health improved. And that was my father.
Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that he was sickly. That's the thing. And it wasn't that he was too old. It was that a light came back. And one person could say, well, it's just a trip to Spain. I mean, what is that? And that's the purpose. The purpose is, to somebody else, it might not seem that it's such a courageous choice, but to you it is. Yeah. And I could tell you client stories, but I think that one hit closer to home. And I almost never tell family stories. And I think you could tell in middle, I'm like, am I going to decide to reveal? But I think it's important because I do believe that then my son gets to watch that metamorphosis. And if you want to talk about generational healing, believe me that that's how it happens in those very small choices that children watch happen, and it changes their trajectory.
And the grandchildren see it. I was doing some research for an article I'm writing, and the statistic was pretty staggering. Recent research has found that grandparents that spend time with their grandchildren have an increased likelihood for a longer and healthier
Markedly so. Yes,
lifetime.
I've seen those studies. Mm-hmm.
Right? And I think it's emotional and physical, right? For one thing, it's like this grandchild is something that you've created, right? So it's like a sense of accomplishment, but also the love that this child can give their grandfather or grandmother is just, there's nothing else in the world like it. And I see my mom and dad just like their eyes light up when they see their grandkids. But even if you take it one step further than that, the physical nature of like picking up your grandkids and going for walks with them keeps our parents more increased motion.
Oh, 100%. Because the mind can tell you, like, I don't really want to, like, my knees hurt, and that's like valid, or my shoulder hurts, and that's valid. But the infusion of love from a grandparent, and that, they're talking about the epidemic of health right now, is that humans sit too much. They literally sit too much. And so if you're thinking, well, I can't do that with my grandchild, it's like, but you could go for a walk. You get out of the house, and that movement, a lot of us have been closed and constricted, and that small movement with purpose, there's a reason why in intact cultures, children spend time with grandchildren. There just is. And so I also see in circumstances where, I see elders in our community that like volunteer at the library. And I think that's a very smart person. Like maybe her grandchildren live far away, or maybe they're close. But you can, I guarantee you, if you're thinking, well, I don't have grandchildren, there has to be somebody that's thinking that right now. And I'm going to tell you that there is some place in your community, whether you are still driving or not driving, depends. I don't know the aperture, how the bandwidth of your listeners, there's always an opportunity because there are children without grandparents. And there are circumstances where you can volunteer your time. And I think that it's easy for me to say, but I can see the light in their eye. I mean, that's the clue. You want to know if somebody is on purpose? Look in their eyes. Is there light in their eyes? And if you're turning away from yourself in the mirror in the morning, that might be an invitation to bring some more senseless joy into your day. Meaning, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be for a reason. But that unmitigated choice to bring a little bit more pleasure can open up another avenue for you.
I think that's so important. I thank you for sharing about your own father and his journey. I think a lot of us can learn from that, because sometimes mom or dad have more to give and they're blocked, and we don't know what can sometimes help unblock them. But like you said, it could be something like a trip or something even smaller than that. But when you see it happen, it's just the most rewarding feeling. So lastly, Kate, what's your biggest piece of advice for our listeners who want to bring their life stories to the page and share the wisdom for future generations, for their own healing or personal journey? What do you think is the best piece of advice we can leave them with?
My best piece of advice is, after you decide to write, I would make an internal, I would say prayer, but you can say statement, to let yourself be led. And so that when you sit down, you meet your own inspirations. Something greater than you can be present, and you will be delighted with what arises.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. For our listeners, if you're ready to capture your life's experiences and share your story into the world, stay tuned to Mind My Age for more inspiring conversations. And please remember, your best years are still ahead. Thank you for joining us on Mind My Age. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit totallife.com for more resources and support. Until next time, stay mindful, stay healthy, and keep thriving.